wanted to make this video for a little while. I was because I think I was looking at my board and how I actually use effects, my pedal board, before I switched back to just kind of using the HX Stomp. And I think I'd seen a comment somewhere around this idea that essentially you buy a MultiFx, and for a lot of people, the kind of route goes that you start using the MultiFx for certain things. You think, wow, that's a great piece of kit. And then eventually you might end up kind of either just using it for one thing, possibly, or a couple of things, or you might just end up going back to single-use type pedals altogether. This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. So no sooner had I started making this video and kind of thinking about the role of the MultiFx in a board for me specifically, and like whether people that prefer individual pedals are missing out, or whether, you know, you buy one of these things and then end up just using one thing at a time or going back to individual pedals. I put together this board and it had an H90 on it with an HX Stomp as well. The HX Stomp is specifically to go to front of house with a couple of delays. The H90 was there, I thought, for phaser and flanger. Now, I actually had a rehearsal yesterday, and it turns out that having a trem might have been a better idea. So I can just change that preset, right? It would have meant, you know, in the real world without a multi-effect, right, well, do I have a phaser? I don't actually have a phaser or a flanger anyway. So I'd be stuck, right? But I can just change the patch and go, right, well, I want a trem there instead, so phaser and trem. But what it did really make me think was that by the time that I've got an HX Stomp and the H90 on the board, that's two ADA conversions. Would I not be better off just basically going all in-house and using something like a Fractal FM9 or like a full Helix and just commit to the idea that I'm going to use the digital stuff in general? Possibly. So if you do open up the window to the multi-effects, do you necessarily end up eventually funneling down to being an all-in-one system? Maybe. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. But yeah, I found a role for the H90 to play and it quickly changed. So I think this is maybe the thing with multi-effects, where it's like you've got this spot on your board and sometimes you might need various things. Something like an HX1, something like an H90. Name your favourite multi-effects below. That you would switch into this sort of slot. I guess there is also the feeling that for some of you guys, potentially some of these are going to change your tone in a way. I don't know if you feel like that. let people know about that in the comments as well. Specifically, the reason I chose to make this video with the H90, so I did ask Eventide a long time ago when this first came out, could I do some videos with it? And they were very generous to send me one with the idea that I'd be making videos with it going forward. And so I'd kind of forgotten that they had this poly synth kind of update. And with this poly synth update, you could do polysynths, which there's only a couple of pedals out there that can do. I think Eventide, EHX do a couple, and Boss, and then also what's the other one? The Strymon CloudBurst, which was more or less what I was kind of thinking with this preset here. So I'd be getting just. So here's the thing, right? So there are definitely going to be some people that are going to try this MultiFx thing, and for some people it won't work at all. I think where this really is perfect is where you kind of have a MultiFx which is sort of pared down in a lot of ways. So I'm very much all in with this idea that you could do pretty much everything with one device. Talk about the HX Stomp in general, or the Helix, or fractal devices. But, you know, there's still a big chunk of people that are still using traditional boards and traditional amps. And for these folks, the MultiFx, I guess, is still a thing that is kind of marketed towards you guys, and a thing that you are encouraged to try from time to time. So, yes, I think you think of something like the Line 6 DL4. Now, that is essentially a delay and looper pedal, but it's got multiple types of delays. It's essentially a MultiFx, but they're kind of one type, right? And you think of the Strymon Timeline. But here's the thing for me as well. Even within the Line 6 Helix world, what I end up using is like a very small curated amount of the actual effects. So for instance, in the delay world, I will really use the dual delay for pretty much everything. Except for if I'm doing like a dotted rhythm type thing, in which case I'd have like the vintage digital. For drives, I'm very often using the Dodd OD250 type. For the reverb, I almost always use the Glitz reverb, which I found kind of sits nicely out of the way in terms of like not kind of crudding up the signal with mud and stuff. In terms of amps, I do jump about with those, but typically the things that I've actually used most of all are like the Line 6 Litigator. So even within this kind of world where I'm in this Line 6, you know, I'm happy using every single thing within there. I basically have pared down choices in a way that I use more or less one type of each thing, and it's kind of just a little bit, well, does that mean therefore that something like the H90, that if I was to use it, eventually I'd probably end up using it more or less for a single use at a time, or, you know, a couple of presets maybe. And how many would you have to use for it to be of value? So I've got a gig coming up where a phaser will be needed, and possibly a flanger as well. Those two to me are somewhat interchangeable in the context that I'm going to be using them. But so if I wanted a really good phaser and a really good flanger, potentially the H90 could fulfill that on my board. If I wanted this really cool kind of synth stuff going on, the H90 could do that job. What else? If I needed a pitch shift, the H90 could do that job. But if I was really serious about those things being staples on my board, potentially something like the Digitech Drop might be the kind of number one choice for that. An MXR Phase 90, if I'm just thinking, right, I need a phaser, if I needed that constantly, would I just end up getting a phaser? Maybe. Um, I don't know what flanger people recommend these days. And a CloudBurst. So what would that come to? Like 300 quid for a CloudBurst. A MXR Phase 90, I'm going to guess, is about 80 quid maybe. And a flanger, maybe about 80 quid. That would come under the price of the H90, where I'm just off the top of my head kind of thinking, like, what are the sorts of things that I could use it for? Like in the intro there, I also used it for a little bit of tube screamer, but I've already got a tube screamer type thing which would be on my board normally. It's kind of one of those things where you think, yeah, it makes obvious sense, but yeah, I guess maybe real estate on the board is one reason why people go with the Eventide H9 specifically for many things. And then the other thing that you got going on is, of course, you can run this with MIDI. So where you have multiple pedals or multiple roles being played by the H90, you could have it, depending on if you've got a MIDI board, on one particular patch, you could have it doing its flanger job. On another patch, it can be doing the phaser job. But yeah, in general, I don't know, is there something really obvious that I'm missing here? Like, for me, in the Line 6 Fractal world and all of that, a huge part of what I do is, like, constant experimentation. But actually, when I'm playing live music, there's almost no experimentation. I go with the things that I know kind of work. And that is sort of a little bit at odds with this other idea of MultiFx, where it's like you need to get the most amount of value out of it to be using lots and lots of things. Is it okay to use a MultiFx for kind of one job at a time? I think of something that was really successful, like the Line 6 M5, which has remained on people like Tim Pierce's and Tom Bukovac's and Mark Letterry's board for like lots and lots of years. And you wonder, like, how many things are you using that for? And if it was just one job at the time, the Line 6 M5 is kind of quite a lot cheaper than many other MultiFx these days, and it kind of made sense economically. An M5, if you're using it for one specific job, I used to really like the particle verb on that thing, or some of the synth tones or whatever you're using it for. If it was on your board and you're only using it for one thing at a time, that would kind of make sense. However, if it's something that is on your board that remains relatively fixed, and it's something like the H90, which I think does a lot of an amazing stuff, but is still quite a pricey pedal. Is there a sense with this stuff that we're using MultiFx for a job that might be done more cheaply with just the component parts of what it is that we're doing with them? I wonder, has anyone else kind of gone through this, noodled through this and thought about it? It kind of remains a little bit in a world of its own, where polysynths are something that Boss can do, as I say, but not with as much flexibility as this in one pedal. They do have their all-in-one kind of synth thing, which could probably definitely get you beyond this. But with all the other effects that Eventide do as well as having the kind of like legendary status that Eventide have. Let me know your thoughts in the comments if you have any. It's just a thought that I'd had about, putting this sort of thing on your board and then thinking, I mean, couldn't I have just had a phaser and a flanger? Maybe.